So I think we're going to have a good discussion about what's happening in Brazil today. I think we have you know, a really great panel here to discuss that. And why don't we first go ahead and give you guys the opportunity to introduce yourselves and your funds.
Great. Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks, Marguerite. Thank you, everyone. So I'm Brett Rochkind. I'm a partner at General Atlantic. We're a global private equity firm, manage about $22 billion. Been at the firm 14 years and run our Palo Alto office. We've been very active in Brazil over the years. We've invested just over $1 billion over the past decade in Brazil and other countries in Latin America. Everything from Mercado Libre in Argentina, Decolar, Lynx, BMF Pavespa, Smiles, and more recently we've done a lot outside of tech in companies like Pagaminas and Sanfer in Mexico and a number of other kind of healthcare and retail consumer platforms. We're also investors in a company called XP Investimentos. I get down to Brazil I used to get down once a quarter when I was on the board of Lynx and Mercado Libre, but now probably once a year though. Before I'll turn it over, speaking of the Olympics, one of the last times I was in Brazil was for the World Cup, and we hosted a GA party in Sao Paulo for the Brazil-Germany game. Oops. And after the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7th goal, that party did not work out as well. We did bring in dancers and other folks to do it. So I was so happy when I watched the Olympics to see, and no one convinces that, to see that Brazil beat Germany in the shootout with Neymar, kind of redeeming himself. So, anyway, congratulations on that power event.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Marguerite, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, be back here. So I'm Carlos Kokron. I run Qualcomm Ventures for Latin America. Qualcomm is the world leader in cellular mobile technologies and also very much involved these days in sort of what we call frontier tech. So next generation mobile technologies helping, everything we've seen from the smartphone revolution is going on to several new different verticals, new different types of businesses. We're really excited to do that, including artificial intelligence, which if you had an algorithm, you would be able to predict that you don't want to do that party that day. But anyway, we too are pretty active in Brazil. We are now at about 14 investments throughout the region, 12 of them in Brazil, and building some great companies, and excited to be here to talk a little bit about the whole scene.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie Ruvolo with LAVCA, the Latin American Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Also want to thank Marguerite for the invitation to be here. It's great to see you guys. LAVCA is a nonprofit membership organization of about 180 private equity and venture capital firms investing in the region. I head up the venture side of things. I think we're particularly known for the comprehensiveness and quality of the data that we publish on venture activity in the region. Until now, that data has been pretty tightly kept, distributed among members, but we're starting to free it up for the benefit of the venture ecosystem and do our part to connect up the different players with information about what's happening in the region and also raise the visibility of venture activity to the global audience as well. As a note, I was actually a journalist in Rio as well before I joined LAVCA. The first story I ever wrote was about Leila at Beleza Natural, and I'm so excited to see you. You're such a rock star. And then more recently wrote for TechCrunch as well. And even as a journalist, I felt this sensation of, it sounds like interesting stuff's happening in the region, but I didn't really have a bigger picture perspective of the data, and we'll dig into that in a little bit. These guys are both member firms as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Romero Rodrigues. I'm managing partner of Redpoint e.ventures. Thank you, Marguerite, for the invitation. Redpoint e.ventures is an early stage VC firm focused on Latin America. We are based in São Paulo, but we do have deep links with Silicon Valley. We are co-sponsored by 2 VC firms here from the Valley, Redpoint and e.ventures, and that's how we got our creative name, Redpoint e.ventures. Really happy to be here.
All right. Well, along this journey to Brazil for Silicon Valley Bank, we've had a lot of really key strategic partners. Marguerite and BayBrazil being one of them. Another has been LAVCA, and in fact, LAVCA helped arrange our first trip together down to Brazil back in 2011. So Julie, I'd like to start with you because you are collating a lot of information about the region now, about Brazil, and talk a little bit about some of the trends from a data perspective on what's happening in venture in Brazil.
Sure. I'm imagining we're a bit more familiar and following this a bit more carefully than you guys, so I'll back up a little bit. In terms of venture activity in the region, you can look at fundraising, how much money is being raised for venture capital funds, how much is being invested. Those are the kind of two main things that you would look at, as well as exits, which we can talk about a little bit later. So if you look at the region overall from Mexico on south, Brazil historically leads in both of those categories. It captures more than half of all of the dollars raised and more than half of all of the dollars invested. So it's kind of the leading giant in the market. If you look at the data from the last 5 years, we have a report called 5-Year Trends on LAVCA.org that outlines this. You actually can see that venture investment's been steadily climbing year over year. So regardless of what's happening in the media and this kind of macro narrative about Brazil, and as a result of Brazil having a perception impact on the rest of the region, the numbers keep going up. Let's see, last year was a banner year. $594 million were invested across 182 startups. By the way, that's just venture capital. That doesn't account a lot of the impact investing. It doesn't account all of the corporate venture capital or all of the angel investment. So the actual numbers are even bigger. We're just looking at strict VC. So yeah, banner year, pretty much a new deal happening every other day, which is pretty cool. We just looked at our first half of the year data versus last year, and the number of deals are up, but actually there's a decline in the level of Brazilian activity, and it's the first time since 2008 that Mexico has done more deals than Brazil. Largely because Mexico has a local government program called e.ventures, which has been seeding new venture capital funds, and we're starting to see a lot of seed activity happening in that region. So just a couple of brief trends that we've been noticing. The first is that we're starting to see over the last year a lot of top Silicon Valley VC firms investing in the region and making their first or second investments. So just to highlight a few deals, just this year we saw Andreessen Horowitz invest alongside with Redpoint e.ventures in Rappi, which is a Colombian grocery delivery service. Founders Fund made their LatAm debut with investments in Just Brazil, which is a legal platform in Brazil, as well as Nubank. And Nubank, if you guys haven't heard of it, Nubank really kicked a lot of stuff into motion. I think last year they closed $80 million in investments from Sequoia, Tiger, I think was in that, Founders, Kazakh, QED, just a hugely interesting constellation of investors. We saw Goldman Sachs investing in CargoX, which is a Brazilian logistics startup. Excel and QED made debut investments in Mexico, in Cornershop. There's some other interesting stuff going on. I could go on and on. There's a lot of interesting deals. So one trend is the entry of these big players. They're not coming in and investing alone. They're coming in and investing alongside local investors. And then two kind of sector trends, which are kind of fun. One is that fintech is emerging as the dominant category of IT investment across the region, but certainly in Brazil as well. So fintech investments are up 40. Fintech investments were about 30% of the IT investments for last year, and it's already 40% of the investments this year. And then the last thing, the numbers are really tiny, but I'm really excited about ag tech. So agribusiness and what's happening in ag tech innovation, and Carlos, you guys have a big hand in this. Historically, ag tech is less than 1% of the venture investment in the region, and anyone who's familiar with Brazil would say there's a huge opportunity there. Brazil's the second biggest agribusiness market in the world, I think. So we've seen a couple of major international players entering in and starting to invest money. Qualcomm is putting a drone on every farm in Brazil. So that's, I would say, some of the highlights and the things that we're following.
Great, thank you, Julie. So maybe turning to the investors now, maybe looking at that intersection where macro and venture meet. Yes, the impeachment is done now, fantastic, and there was a great Olympics. But the economy's in still a pretty severe recession. So how has the current environment economic environment impacted venture, and then Brett, we'll get your perspective from the growth and private equity view as well. And as Julie kind of said in her numbers, that the venture activity, through the first half of this year in Brazil is down both in terms of deal count and by dollars. So is the economy impacting venture fundings as well? Romero, if you want to get us started.
Okay. So I think the number we are seeing for first half is a combination of two things. One is last year was super active, and a lot of funds were active. We were super active. We did 11, 12 investments in the year, and we usually do 4 or 5. So it was out of the shot. The second one is I think the economic situation is somehow affecting investments as well. Not really from the local funds, maybe a little bit the local funds, but mostly the international funds that are usually necessary for the follow-ons, especially Series B. So we don't see as much activity as we saw last year from American and European funds in Brazil for follow-ons.
True that, and we've not seen really a slowdown in the companies for the most part. I mean, some, but these companies grow 2x, 3x a year, so they'll grow a little smaller, but nothing to do with the GDP per se. I'd add to that 2 things on both ends of the VC spectrum. One, I do believe it's affecting sort of fundraising for funds, right? So going and pitching, hey, why should we invest in Brazil? This great place is like, say what, right? People are reading the news, etc. So that's one, and quite frankly, the other one is on the exit side, right? People say, well, should I, we really expect the vast majority of companies to be a trade sale, so to be bought by somebody. And people say, why would they invest in Brazil now? Why would they invest? That's for the guys coming outside, and the guys who are in there, they're like, I don't know what's going on here. I don't want to take a move now. But that's really, I think that's affected that, and again, affected later stage round, BC rounds, where typically we had seen the foreign guys, doing a big portion of those investments.
Do you think, Carlos, with now, again, the new government in place in 2017, a little more optimism, do you think international investors will become more active?
I firmly believe so. So actually, to me, optimism started the day the lady was removed from government some months ago, right? And luckily, the impeachment went through, so no surprises there. Must say a lot of us were nervous, right? So I think you see that in everything. You see stock market going up, the exchange rate coming back down, etc. And I think with that, actually, we'll probably see, I think we'll see a rebound, a quick rebound. Now, in general, that's for FDI and for investments and believing in the country. Getting out of the recession, getting out of the mess, will take quite a while. Will take quite a while, and quite frankly, I think that's the, is Temer going to be able to enact and effect the many changes and reforms that we need, right? I think it would be really a function of that. If he's successful in pushing through those many reforms, I think obviously the situation would be fantastic. If not, it will be better, but just don't know how much better.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of the comments made. I think just as an international investor, maybe one perspective is, if you think of, we invest about $2.5 billion a year. On average, we typically, invest half in the U.S., half outside. We're active in Asia and Europe as well. And so if you think of, we're going to look to probably put maybe 10% in a given year. That's probably a good year in Latin America, broadly defined. Brazil being the major economy of that. So that's $250 million. And I think we've generally done that. We've done that in other sectors than necessarily kind of technology. Partly more, I'd say, a combination of just finding the right quality company. I think at that stage, if you look at the exit environment today, you have kind of Mercado Libre, which is about an $8 billion market cap company on NASDAQ. You have our former portfolio company, Lynx, which is about $1 billion US kind of market cap on the Bovespa. You obviously have TOTUS out there. You have Buscapé as an exit and an M&A event. And so we kind of think of what are those outcomes, and we like to, just given the amount of capital that we manage, we like to see very large outcomes. We're trying to make kind of 3 times our money on fairly large checks. And so I think when we look at that and we look at then the risk element, and I think as Carlos referred to, is the currency has a huge impact on what we do. So I look at like even our Links investment, which we invested in 2011, the real was literally 1.56. I mean, we could not have picked a worse time to invest in the company. Now,
You guys have a knack for that. Party, the exchange rate.
I know. I'll tell you about another investment later. But so the Links is a fabulous business. I don't know how many in the audience are familiar with Links. Probably think of like software companies. I mean, I've been dying to find a Links here in Silicon Valley, which is where I spend 80+% of my time, which is a recurring revenue subscription business. We market it as a cloud company, but more on-prem, and makes a very high profit margin. I don't see many of those in Silicon Valley. I don't know if you do, but if you see SaaS companies doing 30+% EBITDA margins, let me know, because I'll be on the next. I'll take the next Uber there to do the meeting or drive there. So if I look at a company like Links, if we found more of those, we would absolutely invest. I think we ended up actually making very good money and a good return on it despite the currency change, partly because we did exit in 2013 after the IPO in 2014. But in part of our calculus is thinking through, we probably need to make a 4x kind of return to balance the currency. And so when we find those situations, we'll absolutely invest more. But I think we have a pretty high bar, particularly given the environment.
Yeah, so at least at this stage for dollar-based investors, at the real dollar at about 3.2, 3.3, it's a little better than 1.5, right? But Brett, let me just follow on in terms of again this notion of the macros in Brazil, because while the early stage venture companies, I hear my friends saying that their portfolios on average are still growing like 70-80%, despite the recession in the market. Obviously, for private equity, it's a little bit different depending on the segment, maybe not so much tech. But how is it from a private equity view? How are you mentoring and advising your companies in your growth stage and later stage companies in light of the recession in Brazil?
Yeah, so one of our interesting companies, I don't know how many people are familiar with XP Investimentos. I mean, they're right in the heart of economic activity, being a brokerage firm. And we had previously been investors in E-Trade years ago, better than the banks and those that they compete with. And so I think in each market, you have to look at the competitive set. Actually, Nubank, David Velez used to work with me. He's a very good friend, and shame on me. I'm an investor in Kazakh, so I have a small piece of Nubank, but should we have conflict issues, but I would have loved to be an investor in Nubank in its earlier stages, because I think they're going after a secular opportunity. And I think what you almost have to do, and Romero and others that have been operators can speak to it much better, is when you have these economic environments, is you can't change that. That's out of your control. So you have to kind of understand what's happening in that environment, and you've got to take advantage of it. If you have access to capital, then like Nubank does, that's a great time. Now, granted, they are competing against well-capitalized banks and folks that have even more access to capital, but that's a great chance to take advantage and be the market dominant leader. We had a company did not work out as well, Pesce Urbano, which just others received a lot of capital in that market, and it was hard to compete. And at that time, Groupon clearly had its ups and then its downs, and it was harder to evolve that model. But I look at a similar business in China to Pesce Urbano called Meituan, which I'm involved in, and they are crushing it in that market because they really understand and they're taking advantage of their capital lead to beat other competitors. So I think it's all kind of up to kind of assessing that market opportunity and then figuring out where you can take advantage of the economic environment.
Well, let's follow on there, Carlos, in terms of what are some of the kind of hot sectors that you're seeing in Brazil. Fintech's come up a few times now, and can you give us a case study like Brett did on some companies that you're really excited about?
Yeah, so I'll mention a couple. And fintech is definitely, the financial industry in Brazil is extremely cozy, and there's a reason fintech is really, having such a strong effect, every piece of the chain, right? Because there should be competition, but there isn't, right? So it's great to see that, and it's great to see startups trying to disrupt that and change that picture. Margarisi mentioned AgTech, we actually are, as part of this, push from us to bring technology into new use cases, to rather than connect just people, connect things, right? The Internet of Things. We think Brazil is prime for agricultural tech, and we're starting to see a number of startups, pop up and solve again. There's a myriad of things to be solved. So we particularly earlier this year backed Strider, and Strider basically is using tablets on the field to the camera in the tablet as a sensor to figure out whether the crop needs more or less pesticide, right? And then obviously those tablets are connected. It's a SaaS platform, so it's beautiful, growing quite a bit, and obviously huge market. So really excited about that, and we are starting to look at other opportunities. We think this will be a theme for us. On the smartphone front still, the themes that have worked very well for us, and we have a number of plays around logistics and basically marketplaces, right? So take Logi, for example. We invested in Logi 2014, I believe. When we invested, it was by in itself a very large market. They started out with just a sort of courier market, the so-called motorboys. There's 900,000 motorboys in Brazil, right? If you've been to São Paulo, you've probably had your mirror smashed by one of them. And basically, the team did a phenomenal job in terms of vision and execution, in terms of moving beyond that initial product. So they went on to the same-day delivery opportunity for e-commerce. So they've extended the platform to do that. And more recently, they extended it yet again, integrating with the payment solution for food delivery. Not the ordering, the delivery piece, right? So you got the guys like iFood, and these guys are actually saying, once the food has been ordered, how do you get somebody to take it to your place? So, it was already a very exciting company opportunity on its own, just for the courier piece, and then they added a bunch of other stuff, and Fabian and Arthur have done a phenomenal job in building a great team, etc. So we continue to be very, very excited about that. So again, and we'll see opportunities in other verticals. Again, being the digital transformation thing is really being accelerated by the smartphone, and it's taking, it's real estate, it's all sorts of industries being redesigned and made much more optimal given the technology.
You, Romero.
No, I think you covered pretty well. I totally agree with fintech. I think health is getting more and more trendy as well in Brazil. In agri-tech, definitely, especially the overlap of agri-tech and IoT, which is getting more and more sexy in Brazil, given the fact that in Brazil you have completely different environments. So farms are way larger. So what you have for drone technology outside Brazil doesn't work in Brazil well, and things like that. But having said that, I remember 2012, vertical commerce was the trendiest thing in Brazil. 2014 was O2O. Now it's fintech, and when we look back, like there are great companies being built in vertical commerce, for example. We're gonna talk about one in the afternoon. I like to think that it's really important to be sector agnostic. At the end of the day, we are just sponsoring, just trying to help great entrepreneurs with big ideas in gigantic markets.
Thank you, Romero. So maybe contrasting markets a little bit with where we are here in the U.S. cycle. I think in the world of tech unicorns, I think we've seen a unicorn flu, whatever you want to call it. Valuations certainly under pressure here at that level. So, Brett, maybe getting your perspective from GA, how are you seeing late-stage private equity growth in private equity valuations here? How do you feel about the maybe too many unicorns out there, and then maybe contrasting a little bit to the Brazil market and how valuations are playing out in Brazil at this point in time? Is there any carryover from the U.S. market?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the market today, there's just under, I think numbers vary, but just around, let's say, 100 unicorns here in the U.S. Some are companies that focus on consumer internet, some that are enterprise software, some that are fintech and orientation. And generally, I think if you would ask most investors, kind of look through those 100 unicorns and say, who are the ones that you are like really dying to be an investor in? you might get 5 or 10. We were fortunate, we came in very late to Uber, Airbnb, and Snapchat. Those are 3 of them that we were all really excited by. We have a company called AppDynamics in the enterprise software space that we're quite excited by. So there's a few in there that we've managed to make investments. We also were investors in Box, which has had its ups and downs along the way. So I think we feel we're in a good position today, but we definitely have learned a lot through that. So I think there definitely is a barbelling where I think the rounds that made them unicorns are done, and there was getting to be some crazy things where I'd meet with entrepreneurs and they really wanted to be a unicorn, so they would give up tremendous amounts of structure. I mean, many of the things that you've read, I mean, that is legitimately true. I mean, people would give ratchets and different kinds of guaranteed returns to try to become a unicorn because that meant a lot to them and in their kind of peer community of other entrepreneurs. And so you had kind of manufactured unicorns. And then you had hype cycles. In any, as Romero said, in any area, fintech is hot. Well, not everyone's going to win. Right? There's vertical e-commerce, not everyone's going to win, and so you do have this kind of everyone kind of tries to follow the same boat and take advantage of it. And I think what will be really interesting is in the next fundraise, you're starting to see that a little bit. Where do those values get done? And then you put that in the backdrop of the public market, and clearly, one of the things that we've done from time to time, including actually when we got involved with Mercado Libre, is invest in the IPO of the company because that's just a better risk return. And generally, public markets have been more disciplined than private markets, and there's much more transparency in that market, and so you get a true market price. And so I think that still in the U.S. needs to collapse. In related to the Brazilian market, I think you have a little bit of that, although I can't speak to it as closely as Carlos or Julie or Romero can, as to kind of what are potential unicorns in that market. Clearly, I mean, I think Nubank is doing great, but also I think they have, very early investors. They got a lot of hype behind them, and so they've been able to take advantage of that and raise it at very high values. It was a very competitive deal this time around in Tiger, and so I think they do benefit. And I think there is some investors you may talk to, kind of look for opportunities outside Silicon Valley because of just where valuations have gotten to. So I think there are opportunities for those kind of outlier Brazilian companies to get really good values because people do want to invest. But and they do take that barbell model that you look at in the U.S. of kind of only 10 of 100 are very good, and you apply that to Brazil, and people want to be in those leading companies, and so they will pay up to do that. And I think that is a little bit of the dynamic, at least I've seen some of the deals we've reviewed in Brazil.
How about Romero at the early stage in terms of valuations today? Obviously, Brazil. The cycle's been a little bit different, right? Arguably, maybe 2011, 12 was sort of the peak, and it's been a lot more, rational, let's say.
Yeah.
So how are valuations playing out in the early stage in Brazil right now?
Okay. So I think in general terms, they went down, but in average, but mostly because if you have a good project, a great team, and a really good startup, you won't see your valuation going down, at least not in local currency. Because in early stage, I don't think valuations get that affected. But the ability to raise the round gets really affected. So if you don't have an A+ team, it's not that you're going to raise in a lower valuation, you're just not going to raise. That's it. So I think liquidity gets affected, but not really valuations. That's what we have been seeing. So you need to have great team, great idea, big market.
And Carlos, do you get that team that comes in and says, well, in the Silicon Valley, company X raised money at a $50 million valuation, we want something similar. Do you have that conversation? Or?
You can want whatever you want, right? The reality is, again, the valuation will settle where eventually the market will be willing to pay, right? So it's very obvious what I'm saying. So we do get people and we use benchmarks, but I think the aspirations are different. I think the aspirations are different, and I think when you see a larger round for us at the stage of the industry where we are, when you see rounds of 30, 50, 70, that's like a hell of a win for Brazil, right? And I get a little, this whole unicorn thing is like, a lot of it's just paper and hype and whatnot, right? Ultimately, we're looking to back entrepreneurs, help them, support them to build, great companies that eventually will find their way. I mean, look at Mercado Libre when they went out, right? It was already a great company, right? And I think they went, if I recall right, they went out, their IPO price was 800 million. Today it's 10x that, in less than 10 years, right? That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome, right? So again, VCs have a role in, early stage of the companies. You guys come in at later stages, and ultimately public markets. The IPO is not the end. It's a means to hopefully a life to eternity, right? And so again, I'm very happy with the $50 million round, the $30 million round for the company, and I'm not looking so much at what was the valuation that was done at.
And Julie referenced again in her numbers that the deal count in dollars are down year over year. How does that translate into deal flow? Are you still seeing good teams? What are the opportunities in terms of entrepreneurs? What's the quality of the entrepreneurs today?
Definitely. I've never seen it so bad. So I've been in the market for quite a while, as you guys like to joke. And really,
I won't say the grandfather of venture capital.
No, but it's not as much as 5 years ago. So maybe 10 years ago. It's really slim pickings, right? You'd have very few great guys with great ideas who sort of knew how to, get to a point and get traction, etc. Today, we see a lot of great opportunities. Again, I think in Brazil, I don't know if Romero agrees or not, but to me, there is really a Series B crunch, not a Series A crunch. So people are happy to write C checks, people are happy to write A checks. It's really, can you make that A round check, really, can you leverage that check to get to metrics that people say, wow, I'm really excited to do a B check. That's been, I think, the biggest thing. But again, and at that point is really, maybe a little less product market fit and more really about traction, right? But we're excited. We're seeing new use cases. So again, as Romero mentioned, health tech. We have one investment together. We met. It was actually an accelerator company. It's just incredible how well they've gone over time. And by the way, everything in Brazil, whether you like it or not, takes longer. We're not in the valley, right? Yep. So a company, for it to sort of mature and really start a lift off, right? It will probably take an extra couple of years to sort of get to that phase. And I think so long as we understand that, and the GPs tell their LPs that this is the play, but ultimately that there is, big companies with great ideas, etc. I think that's fine. That's my view.
When we were looking at the 10 largest deals from 2015, 8 out of the 10 had international co-investors. And all of the big rounds we've seen so far this year, it's been the same case. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. Are they coming in and filling in this B crunch? Like, is that something that you would eventually want to have the Brazilian ecosystem to be able to support and follow on in those companies? Or is there this kind of emerging, bridging dynamic going on?
No, I think both things will happen. Again, as the deal flow is getting more and more solid, and better entrepreneurs and better companies are getting funded for Series A, we're going to have better companies for Series B, C, and so on. And the macroeconomics was kind of moving people away of Brazil a little bit. It's not happening anymore. So at least from my side, in the last 4 or 5 weeks, we could see a lot of interest in Brazil coming back. And a lot of international VCs trying to understand what is in several different funds portfolio to understand there's a good opportunity. So I think the gap will be filled by international VCs, but I foresee some local players in the early growth stage as well.
So, we talked about good quality teams coming in. What about management talent? We've heard a few times this week, in light of the recession, that people are willing to leave their bigger corporate jobs to jump in to lead a startup. What's your sense, Carlos?
I had the opportunity to actually work as a VC investor in the U.S. as well, and clearly this is still a gap for us, right? In the U.S., you see the picture, the figure of the professional startup CFO. I actually met a CFO who, was a CFO of a startup, got picked up by Alcatel for $200 million, then the same VC brought him on to another company that was bought by $400 million. So he was in with the same VC, and the fourth CFO gig, right? Obviously, so he understands. Getting somebody from a large company to join a startup, it's still a bit of a challenge, right? Even if the will is there, sometimes the skill is not there, right? It's very different, very different. Indeed, Romero built a company from nothing to huge, right? You can probably attest to that, and you can probably tell, you know, have you ever tried to bring guys, oh, it's great, he worked at HP his entire career, must be great. Well, or some other company, typically that doesn't work. So I think it's still, we're seeing more of that, and I think in the panel yesterday, somebody actually mentioned that they want to come in as part of the, not necessarily to the top job, but rather just to be part of the team, and maybe that's a better role than, right? But I think, again, as we see the market, the ecosystem, the evolution of that, I think we'll start to see more. I haven't seen too many of that situation.
What I think is good in this behavior is that access to talent, if you go back to 2012, when the Christ was flying up in the Economist cover, the biggest headline, negative headline about Brazil was talent shortage. And we know that talent fuels startup growth. So the fact that the young talented guy is willing to go to startup, not to found a startup, but to be an executive on the startup early days, it could be a game changer in terms of the quality of the companies in Brazil.
And Brett, how about you from a growth equity perspective? How do you see management talent in Brazil relative to what you're seeing here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as deep. So you really have, that said, I think you find that there are exceptional entrepreneurs. I mean, I'd put Marcos Galperin next to anyone. I think he and his team are some of the best that we've encountered globally. And so I think there's definitely talent there. And you're also starting to see people really returning. Like, it was funny, if you look at like the Nubank team, I don't think any of them are Brazilian. I mean, literally, David's Colombian. The CFO was a former GA colleague as well. He just moved on, but he was American. You've got folks from Europe. So you have talent that is seeing the opportunity in Brazil and filling in for maybe some holes where it is now. It's not the general situation per se, but there are those specific situations. I think I looked at like a vertical commerce company that was run by a German that had no background in Brazil, but just saw an opportunity there. So I think people see the economic opportunity there with the 180, 190 million people. They see the size of the economy, and they see a way to kind of differentiate themselves in that talent pool in a neat way. So I think you definitely just don't see it as deep, but I think the quality of the entrepreneurship at the highest level is the same.
And we started to cover a bit about follow-on financing and being somewhat reliant on the international investors. So maybe Julia, you've been covering this a little bit more closely in the LAVCA newsletters. What is your sense in terms of, or your expectation going into the second half of this year and into next year around the mood of international investors looking at Brazil, looking for those later stage opportunities?
Yeah, I'm obviously a few steps removed from it, but trying to assemble a bigger picture perspective. I was just looking at the first half of the year data, and it's a very quick window to look at as well, right? Because even if you look at fundraising year over year for the last 5 years, you kind of have to look at that in bigger blocks as you look at the length of the fund cycles as well. But outside of the data, the energy around what's happening is pretty clear to me. And you've got a lot of energy. I'm particularly intrigued probably because I just moved back to San Francisco and I've been focusing on it, on the syndicates that are being formed between global and local investors and increasingly corporate venture investors as well. So you guys could probably speak more specifically to it, but also a bunch of folks making really interesting direct investments, including the IFC and Guia Bolsu. There's some really interesting things underfoot, which makes me wonder what kinds of conversations you guys are having for upcoming deals or deals that didn't quite pull together or what have you.
Romero or Carlos, any insights on follow-on financing?
Whether we are having conversations with the likes of IFC and
Just what you think of it. Do you see an increasing trend in kind of international local syndicates?
yeah,
Are
yes,
people
yeah.
coming to you guys? Well, you're international.
No, but yes, the short answer is yes. Again, I think back to the early point of the conversation, I think maybe some appetite was lost in the last 9 months, but we are seeing that, and they haven't really gone away, right? I think it's just really sort of the obvious cases. They're like, wow, this is a breakout already, that maybe it's easier to get funding for. Some of the other ones that are doing well, but the people are maybe a little more on the sidelines. But again, I don't think they'll go back. I think, really, my view is, just like I use the Mercado Libre example, I think our industry will grow several-fold over the next few years, right? Because the opportunity is there. You got the critical mass of, very talented investors, entrepreneurs, etc. The pain points are there. Everything's accelerating. So I personally, I'm pretty bullish on the whole opportunity. And again, I think wave specifically to, outside investors, we will see them come back.
How about you, Romero? Are you?
You saw that phenomenon in India, right? I mean, you look at India. India is 10 times hotter, 100 times hotter than Brazil right now, right? There's way too much money. It's cooled off too, but as you look at the amount of capital that's there, right? On a relative basis, we're way behind. We're way behind, and okay, you can say that there's too much there, agree? But actually, I think there's, on our side, there should be a whole lot more as well.
So Romero, when guys like Brett come along, are they bottom fishing? Are they saying, hey, maybe if we drop that valuation in half, maybe we'll invest at this point? What kind of reaction are you getting from international investors?
No, I think I heard once. Gonna repeat it here. It's basically you have two forces on the scale: fear and greediness, and that's pretty much the two forces that shape the whole investment environment. So as much as the opportunity got way bigger in the last 2 years, fear went bigger in a faster pace because of the macroeconomics. And I think once the lady is out of the office, fear is getting smaller and smaller, and the opportunity is getting bigger. So it's simple math. And I've been seeing growth stage funds even trying to accommodate smaller checks than they usually do to fill the Series B gap, which is quite interesting. So guys that are used to write 30 million, 40 million checks as an exception, because it's usually larger, are trying to write 15 or 20 million checks, maybe dividing into tranches or trying to be creative, because the opportunity is so big that they are willing to put less money to work because they're probably expecting higher returns for that money. So.
I just want to add to that. So this is clearly a gap in our ecosystem, which is the sort of local investors who can do, large Series B, C checks, right? And these guys, maybe there are a few of them, and maybe they're actually more valuation conscious than the U.S. guys, because the U.S. guys see the bigger picture, and they've seen the movie a number of times, and they say, okay, this can get larger, will get larger. Whereas the other guys, this is sort of the first time doing this, and they have to be more conservative.
If I could just step outside of the math for a minute, in terms of where is this all going, I go back to the first set of statistics that blew my mind about 1.5 years ago. I don't know how many of you guys know this. Brazil has about 120 million people online. It's about half the population. It's already the #1. Brazilians spend more time on social media than any other population on the planet. They're already the #2 or #3 audience, depending on the data you're looking at, on every single major social platform. And you could even say Brazilians were kind of the original social audience with Orkut, right? Which started off as a Silicon Valley, very insidery thing, and then the guy from the EFF gave out invites to his Brazilian friends, and all hell broke loose, which was amazing. And it took Facebook years actually to surpass Orkut in Brazil. So you just look at that and you see the population is set to double. You've got a really interesting social impact happening as well. What's it going to mean when you have the poorest, most disenfranchised, marginalized, rural, and youth segments of the population online communicating with each other? And on top of that, you've got this mobile trend, which is that everybody who's coming online now is coming online with cheap Android phones into a mobile-only world. And I get chills every time I repeat these statistics. They're big, broad brush strokes, but that's huge. And I'm really excited to be in the middle of this and reminding as well now that I've been tracking this stuff for a while, how quickly things move, and the conversation's going to move very quickly.
Certainly lots of
Just
great
a slight
opportunities.
correction, they're inexpensive Android phones, not cheap.
Coming from Mr. Qualcomm.
I meant that in a good way.
So we have a couple of minutes left, and I know a BayBrazil audience is always going to have questions. I have more, but I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Who has a question? There we go. We have some mics here that we can.
My name is Ricardo.
Hello. Thank you. My name is Ricardo from Brazil, the company Cianet. I would like to know your opinion about the IT environment companies. If a new bubble is coming or not. If yes, how the small companies and startups have to do to be safe?
And you're talking about Brazil, in Brazil, if a bubble.
No, a world level, because the world is connected, right?
Okay, so globally, is there another tech bubble happening? I think is the question, and then what do startups have to do to adjust that? I guess.
Is it the question now as to whether it's really a valuation bubble? Whereas I remember the bubble over a decade ago, people were like, is this internet thing going to be around? You know? So it seems like it's a qualitatively different discussion, for one. There's no question that this stuff's going to keep growing.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're actually starting to see the convergence of many different technologies, which, you know, they all potentiate the other ones. So I'm obviously biased, and you know, we're investors, we're optimists, and we're in the tech industry, so biased and bullish. But I wouldn't call it a bubble. I'd say it's just going to keep on growing.
Yeah, I guess one word of advice though is, you know, as Julian Garza said, it's a valuation bubble, and yeah, what that basically means is if it does pop, that the cost of capital will just be much higher. And what we found is, you know, companies that are just much more capital efficient will be able to sustain that. Because I think once you put it in a position where you're in control and you're really seeking, you know, investors are seeking you, it's a very different dynamic. There's certain markets or industries where the unit economics and the competitive landscape, you need to have a large capital base to compete. Clearly Uber's, you know, one of those, particularly in China and globally. But I think if you can really look at it, and I think we had some of this conversation before at lunch, is and really let the product drive a lot of what you normally would spend on sales and marketing to do customer acquisition. That's so powerful. And so then you're in a position where you're in control and you're not, you know, at the mercy of the markets, and that's the best place you can possibly be.
Also generalizing slightly, but the sense I get from Brazilian investors when I speak with them is that the startups themselves just expect to be more capital efficient because they don't have the expectation that they're going to raise hundreds of millions of dollars and have a unicorn run over a rainbow into IPO land. So I've heard that that's the case. I've especially heard that from folks like the Kazakh team and you who've gone through the experience yourself, that it's a bit of a different culture there in some ways that I think is a benefit.
I think the Brazilian entrepreneurs here, you might be surprised that only in the last few months has unit economics and profitability kind of crept back into the vocabulary here in the Bay Area, so it's a little bit different here. Next question. I think we had one there first, yeah.
Hey, thank you for thanks for the question. My question is basically, I work in globalization. My name is Brian Afrasiabi, and I work with a lot of tech companies who raise Series C, Series B funding, specifically to expand into global markets. And Latin America, as you can imagine, Brazil is a very popular place to go. So my question is, when it comes to localizing, one of the main challenges they're having is actually localizing all their content into foreign languages, not only their content, but actually their finance and their operations as well. So I'm curious, how has some of your clients and your experience, and how did they overcome that localization challenge?
Are you talking about like expanding within the region, or potentially like going from other countries in the region, or localizing between LatAm and the US, or just any direction?
Yes, specifically for Latin America or for Brazil. Let's say they want to, one of your companies has raised funding to expand into the Brazilian market. How do they actually localize that content into the foreign language and in order to be successful?
So, if I may quote Antonio Carlos Jobim, he used to say Brazil is not for amateurs. But what he really meant is, and we suffer a lot when we try to expand Buscapé to other countries of Latin America. Depending on what the business model is, a playbook will not work. We saw what happened with AOL when they tried to use a playbook in Brazil. If you have a really global type of business model with global network effects like Google or Facebook, then you might use a playbook. And even though they didn't, I guess, but you might. But if you have a local business model, you have to understand the region. So, for example, my past experiences in e-commerce, you get Amazon, for example. Amazon never enter a market the same way twice. So they really understand the dynamics of e-commerce because it's super local, and they create a strategy for each one of the regions differently. So I don't think it's a recipe, unfortunately.
Next question.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. My name is Esteban. I am with Kitin. We are a consulting group that provides back office support for startups in the Bay Area. And my question, I'd like to know how do you see the corporate venture in Brazil and how this compares to corporate venture in the US also?
We just
Thank you.
happened to have one, right?
I'll take that. So it's a new phenomenon, and we are starting to see a lot of people talk about it. So we're seeing companies in the insurance industry, banking industry, agriculture business, retail, in general, financial industry start to think about it. And I think it'll be very positive, a positive phenomenon. I always like to say that I would really, I think the ideal scenario for them would be to sort of be a contributor, a complementary investor to financial investors, but think and act like a financial investor. I'm not convinced that that's what I'm seeing, so some of them are a little bit more, hey, I want you closer to my companies, etc. And I think mid to long term that may hurt the company or the co-investors, right? So if I, again, if I could pick, and I always give this recommendation, people ask me, hey, how should I do this, etc. That's my recommendation. Be independent, be agnostic. It's great to be involved early on, and as the company matures, if it makes sense, your paths will cross, and you'll be able to help the company and maybe have them use your gear, etc. But don't try to do that too early on.
Just also to comment that we're seeing this kind of corporate activity starting to percolate in terms of, are these guys going to be direct investors of themselves? Are they going to be launching acceleration programs? And we're seeing more and more kind of vertical acceleration programs where corporates are coming in and sponsoring it and see strategic gain.
I would like just to notice that it's early days in Brazil for corporate venture, and people are still trying to understand exactly in which stage they're going to enter and how they're going to enter. And what sometimes corporations don't understand is the adverse effect. So to operate in the early stage, you need to be aware that if you're putting together, let's say, accelerator to find out the best education startup, because you are education corporate, and you want to use this to get insights for your internal innovation, you're probably going to have adverse selection, which means the brightest entrepreneur who has this great idea that's going to disrupt you, he'll never come to you. And if he comes to you, it's because he couldn't raise money in other place. So in fact, instead of getting the best, you get the worst. And you need to understand how you're going to act in different stages, from seed, Series A, early growth, and growth. And different companies are doing different things, but we have been seeing things that are extremely smart, in my opinion, and things that are not that smart, in my opinion, as well.
All right, well, Margarita tells me we're about out of time, so I'm sure these guys are going to be around for more questions. One last one? Is that all right, Margarita?
Yes,
One
yes,
quick
go
one?
ahead.
Sorry. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so here in the U.S., there is entrepreneurs found a creative way to raise money through crowdsourcing. So sites like Kickstarter and Indigo, and then a lot of products get out there because the public raised money, and then it attracts VCs and investors. So I was wondering, is this phenomenon also happening in Brazil? And if it's not happening, do you see it happening in the future?
I know Argentina just announced a new package of laws to facilitate entrepreneurship, and that includes a law to facilitate crowdfunding. I haven't seen that in Brazil, but if you look at the region, generally it's really interesting to think about models like AngelList and Funders Club and others, and how they're shaking things up, particularly for first and second time fund managers, guys that are looking to raise amounts of money that are really so small that traditional LPs aren't necessarily interested. So the idea of being able to raise money on a deal-by-deal basis, or for a startup to come and use a platform like Republic, which just launched in the US, I think it's going to be some time, but I certainly see opportunity. That's already changing the venture model out here.
Anything to add, Vance?
I think I totally agree to Julie. If you are thinking about raising money for a software consumer startup, models like AngelList really works. If you are talking about the traditional crowdfunding model like Kickstarter, I've been seeing more success in hardware and products than software or anything else. So usually it's a great way to start a hardware company, not really for internet service so far.
Definitely the last question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Alex. Thanks for the panel. This has been very interesting.
I'll probably move down if we... Anybody have...
I can suggest you a great real estate broker. Don't worry.
Look, I think most of this crowd, probably the vast majority, will feel the same way, right? That it's obviously it would be a bit of a disaster, right? Just to put it nicely. But he's got a huge following, and it's a tight race. So it's scary. It's scary. I think we're not the demographic, right? The demographic, certainly not the demographic. So, but it's very scary to see the numbers, etc. I said earlier we were scared, to be honest, about the votes of Senate in Brazil for Dilma's impeachment, right? It was for a different reason, but some of it is just this whole populism, etc., etc. It was scary as well. It's always when it's this tight, and when the world's this polarized, it's never good, right? So I hope really for the for the entire world that it doesn't happen. But I don't think there's much we can do about it.
Yeah, I think while you guys got rid of the lady, we want the lady.
What a great way to end our discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists.